Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at the October Revolution of 1917 when the Bolsheviks seized power. So this follows on from the February Revolution of 1917 where the Tsarist system had collapsed, and we then have the period of Provisional Government. And it's then in October, driven forward by the ideas and ideology of Lenin and then organised by Trotsky, that the Bolsheviks seized power, and this then is going to lead us into our next big stage of Russian history, which is the period of Communist Russia. This video is part of my series on Tsarist and Communist Russia, going all the way through from 1855 to 1964. And it's an important point, this bit. Now, how important depends on your view, really, because this is either the beginning of this incredible change with a movement to communism, or this is a moment where the opportunity of a liberal, democratic, progressive Russia is lost, and you actually, having seen this chink in of possibility in 1917, Russia moves from one dictatorship into another. So how you view this is in terms of a changing point in history. It depends on how you see those different elements, but undoubtedly this is a massively important part of Russian and world history, and it involves an incredibly significant shift in world political ideology, and this is kind of Marxism, or in particular Leninist Marxism, being put into action. Now, the situation in September of 17 is one which the Bolsheviks are starting to think that they might be able to take advantage of. Now, the Bolsheviks were an incredibly dedicated group of political activists, and Bolsheviks had continued going to the Soviets in Petrograd and Moscow and all over Russia in a way that some of the other groups had lost a bit of their enthusiasm after that initial seizing of power in February 17. And so as the numbers of the other parties dwindled and the numbers of the Bolsheviks didn't, then when they were in groups in the Soviet of hundreds rather than thousands, then the Bolshevik voice became a bigger and more powerful one. So they gained more and more influence in these different Soviets. In September, there were new elections for the Petrograd Soviet, and the Bolsheviks for the first time gained a majority in the Petrograd Soviet, and they did this on a combination of the failings of the Provisional Government, which I've looked at in previous videos, and also because of the events of the Kornilov affair, and this had made the Bolsheviks incredibly popular in Petrograd, as they were seen as the saviours of Petrograd, as the defenders of Petrograd. And all of this had increased their importance. The Bolsheviks are a significant group. They've got about 200,000 members. They produced 41 different newspapers, including their key mouthpiece, which was Pravda, which means truth. And the Red Guard numbered about 10,000. So this highly dedicated kind of revolutionary army that was now very, very well armed, having been armed by the Provisional Government to defend Petrograd against Kornilov. And the Bolshevik success, yes, we see it in Petrograd, but it's not only in Petrograd. We see it in other cities and places, including Moscow. The Provisional Government was facing some fairly significant problems. So the army was just disintegrating. Soldiers were deserting following the disastrous Southern Offensive, notably in July. There were food shortages in the cities, and these hadn't been solved by the Provisional Government. And the grain supply coming in from the countryside just kept on declining. Inflation was a massive problem. It was absolutely rampant. And again, with all these economic and social problems, this all interlinks with uprisings. There was real unrest in the countryside. Manor houses were being burned down. Landowners were being attacked. Law and order also broke down in the urban areas. Robbery and house break-ins massively increased, and being well-dressed and wealthy essentially often would lead you to being attacked and beaten up in the streets by angry workers. Now, they were angry because they were hungry. They were angry because they thought the world was going to change when the Tsar fell, and it hadn't. And part of that is the circumstance. In fact, remember, we're still in World War I at this point, and part of it is to do with mismanagement and failings by the government, and part of it, in a way, was almost the expectation was so great that it couldn't be met at this point in time. Now, Lenin saw this as always a great opportunity. So he was off in exile in Finland, whilst others, including Stalin, who was a fairly minor player in the leadership of the Bolshevik Party at this point, was still in Petrograd. Obviously, Stalin is going to go on and become a really important part of the story later on. But at this point, he's not one of the absolute leading lights. He's very useful, good enforcer. He's also quite handy at doing things like robbing banks to generate funds. Now, by September, Lenin was going, right, we need to now seize the moment. He had argued all the way back from 1902 that capitalist and socialist revolutions, they could happen in quick succession. Marxist theory, others' interpretation of Marxist theory is essentially these separate epochs. There needed to be a big gap, and Marx, for example, had watched what was going on in Britain and saw this as a process. Now, Lenin's view of Marxism, Leninist Marxism, said that essentially these things can happen almost together, essentially. And this, he said, was the moment. And he wrote on the 12th of September, history will not forgive us if we do not assume power. And he regarded the February Revolution as a capitalist takeover. He argued that the Provisional Government would become increasingly counter-revolutionary. Now, this plays into some of the stuff that we'll look at a bit later in the video, because actually, as word spreads that the Bolsheviks are going to try and seize power, then Kerensky kind of does become counter-revolutionary because he's trying to stop the Bolshevik Revolution, at which point the Bolsheviks can turn around and point at him and go, you're being counter-revolutionary. So again, he's in a complete lose-lose situation with it. And so Lenin argued that a socialist revolution should take place in October. Now, he then slipped back into Petrograd around the 7th of October, and the Bolshevik Central Committee then met to decide on what was going to happen. Now, Lenin, in his meeting with the committee, he argued that there was a strong chance of a second Kornilov affair. So one general had tried to seize power and it had failed, but just because Kornilov had failed didn't mean that it wouldn't happen again. And again, that's something that needed to be guarded against. Following the July offensive, the Germans were advancing eastward and could conceivably take Petrograd in the foreseeable future. So the war needed to stop. There was unrest within Germany, or at least reports of unrest in Germany, and there was this idea that there might actually be revolution in Germany as well, and therefore the internationalists, this idea of international revolution, communist revolution spreading across Europe and across the globe, was one that Lenin pointed to, and that Russia and the Bolsheviks needed to be at the forefront of this. The next All-Russian Congress of Soviets was set for the 26th of October. Now, that date we're going to see is really important. And essentially, if the Bolsheviks could seize power before then they could turn up at the Congress of all the Soviets and say, look, we're in power. This is done. It's a fait accompli. It's all over. And then that would undermine any oppositions to them from the Mensheviks or the SR, the other socialist groups. And the Bolsheviks could then say, well, actually, we have carried out a socialist revolution. You're not involved in it. You don't get the power. You are now going against us. You are counter-revolutionary rather than revolutionary. Obviously, the Mensheviks and the SR, we've seen them through the Tsarist period, are revolutionaries. They wanted to overthrow the Tsar. They wanted to change everything that was going on. But this Lenin sees as a way of the Bolsheviks separating themselves even further from these two groups. Obviously, they've separated themselves from them during the period of the Provisional Government, but separate themselves from them firmly and go, right, we are the proper socialist revolutionary group. We are the group that has seized power. You guys haven't. You've been working with the bourgeoisie. You've been working with the capitalists. You've been working with the liberals. We haven't. We are the proper socialists, you aren't, and that's an important part of this strategy. Now, the next steps to revolution then. So there's a vote on the committee, and this takes place on October the 10th. He wins by 10 votes to 2. There are two very important, significant Bolshevik leaders who voted against him, Zinoniev and Kamenev. Again, we'll see more of them later in the story of communist Russia. But Lenin wins, and people get on board. So the Bolsheviks now had to start to plan how to seize power. Now, the mastermind behind all of this is going to be Trotsky. It's Trotsky who then works out the timing. Remember, I've already mentioned about the 26th of October, and he said, well, we need to coincide it with that. And actually, it was Trotsky who was involved in all the planning and execution of the seizure of power. So Lenin, yes, it was his idea to seize power, but the actual planning of seizing power and carrying it out is done by Trotsky. And this is highlighted by a journalist who was there in Reed in his very famous book 10 Days That Shook the World. And again, but we have this thing as we go into communist Russia where the history starts getting rewritten, and Stalin very much tries to rewrite the story of the October Revolution. And this is demonstrated in Sergei Eisenstein's October, which was a film made in 27, shot in 27, sent out in 28 to try and to celebrate and to give an account of the revolution and the glory of it. And in that, Stalin makes Eisenstein reshoot that film, or elements of that film. So Trotsky is portrayed as a coward and as a kind of, it's a very anti-Semitic portrayal as well. And so all behind this, we've got these different key characters. So, but Zinoviev, Kamenev, Stalin, Trotsky, Lenin are going to all be central in the story of what comes next in communist Russia. Now, whatever other kind of qualities the Bolsheviks had, keeping a secret definitely didn't seem to be amongst them at this particular moment in time, because the idea that the Bolsheviks were going to seize power became quite widely known. And Kerensky started to try and stop it happening, which seems, again, perfectly sensible. But again, then it's going to then lead to this argument the Bolsheviks keep on portraying him as being against the people, against revolution, trying to keep hold of power for himself and the liberals and the elites and the bourgeoisie and all of that. So he ordered some of the more radical army units out of Petrograd, and again he does that because he wants to stop those seizing power on behalf of the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks then say, look, Kerensky is leaving the city undefended, so the Germans or another counter-revolutionary general, like another Kornilov Mark II, can storm the city, and that's what he's setting up for. And he goes, I'm not, I just don't want them to take power. On the basis of this, the Bolsheviks persuade the Soviets to set up the Military Revolutionary Committee, or MRC, to defend the city in case of attack. The MRC was led by Trotsky, and again, who is planning the revolution to overthrow. And this, again, is a brilliant move by the Bolsheviks, because it means that the Bolsheviks and their Red Guard control the MRC, and this gives them access to even more weapons and even more ammunition. And they'd already gained a load of that from the Kornilov effect. Now, they are now, without doubt, the best armed group in Petrograd, and therefore their seizing of power is going to be made more straightforward. Kerensky continues, and again, some people argue this is a mistake. He continued to try and take action against the Bolsheviks. He starts shutting down the newspaper, trying to restrict the power of the MRC. He even started to raise bridges that link the working class areas to the centre of Petrograd. It looks like he's just trying to hold on to power for himself. It looks like he's counter-revolutionary. He's not working with the Soviet. And this fueled the idea that Kerensky was betraying the February Revolution, was betraying the Soviet. That the Bolsheviks were trying to correct him, to stand up to him. Kerensky at this point essentially gives up. He can see that there are almost no troops loyal to the Provisional Government left, and definitely not enough to stand up against the Bolsheviks. And he flees in a car that he borrowed from the U.S. Embassy. He tells the other ministers that he's going to go for help, and he's going to return with reinforcements. But eventually, he's just going to end up in exile in Paris and then New York. So the timeline of events. So the 24th going into the 25th of October, that night, Trotsky ordered the Red Guard, along with other soldiers and sailors loyal to the Bolsheviks, to seize key points in Petrograd, such as bridges, telephone exchanges, the railway stations, the power stations. There was very little resistance to this, and again, so it's also like a kind of a bit of a bloodless coup, where the Bolsheviks, who are armed and without very little or nobody really willing to stand in their way, simply just start taking the strategic parts of Petrograd. On the day of the 25th, life in Petrograd largely continued as normal. Shops and restaurants were open, taxis and trams operated as usual, people went about their everyday business. So we've had a night where the Bolsheviks have gone and seized all the key strategic locations. We then have to have a normal day. It all seems, again, to me, this all seems particularly surreal. And then that evening, the sailors on the Aurora battleship, which was on the River Neva in Petrograd, started firing a series of, well, they turned out to be blanks, but firing from its 6-inch cannons. I mean, this then caused a degree of panic, particularly amongst the provisional government, who are terrified of now what's going on, and it's a real kind of a show of strength. Now the sailors of the Baltic Fleet were particularly known as Bolshevik sympathizers and keen on revolution, and again, this is highlighting the kind of fruitlessness or the lack of any ability to defend themselves against what was going on by the provisional government. So that night, the 25th going into the 26th, the Red Guard surrounded the Winter Palace at the centre of Petrograd, the headquarters of the provisional government, and the palace is essentially undefended. There are some officer cadets, and there are a part of a woman's battalion. And then the Red Guard stormed the Winter Palace. The officer cadets were swiftly disarmed. The women were allowed to leave unharmed. A search of the palace finally found the members of the provisional government who had remained, and they were arrested. And there was celebration, and there was looting, essentially, at this point. The Bolshevik seizure of power had been very straightforward. There'd hardly been any casualties on either side. And really, what this, I think, shows us more than anything else is a complete lack of support for the provisional government. Just comes to show how, to a degree, it was almost a non-event, although it's hugely so historically significant. But actually, as an event, it was a bit of a non-event. Is that the filming of Eisenstein's October in 2728 actually did more damage to the Winter Palace than the revolution itself did. And I think it was probably a little bit more dramatic than the actual event. And normally, an armed revolution is not something you have to beef up the kind of drama of. The October Revolution seems to be one where possibly that is the case. So following on from this, then, so the Bolsheviks have seized power. So then, the 26th of October, where Lenin addresses the Congress of all Soviets, Mensheviks, and some members of the SR objected to the seizure of power, just as Lenin had set up that they would, but it would be a fait accompli that the Bolsheviks said, well, we seize power, we're revolutionaries, you're working with the enemies of the people, you're counter-revolutionary, we aren't. Lenin sets up the Council of the People's Commissars. It's a cabinet. It's completely dominated by Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks storm out. Now, Trotsky, who remember previously had been a Menshevik, famously stated that they were heading to where they belonged, which was into the dustbin of history. Rather worryingly, at this point, we then start to see the Bolsheviks' kind of grip of power kind of really increasing rather quickly. So the Cheka is set up, which is the new secret police. And it was very obvious very quickly that the Bolsheviks had no intention of sharing power with other revolutionary groups. So members of the Mensheviks and SR, people who you would have thought were very closely aligned to a lot of the Bolshevik ideas, were arrested along with the political groups which clearly are opposed to the Bolsheviks. And Lenin, again, there was a lot of his wording was very strong. So he made it clear there would be that the Bolsheviks would make no fetish of democracy. So he doesn't believe in democracy. That isn't what he sees as the route forward. It's not part of the socialist the socialist movement, or the socialist movement through the remaining epochs. And he also had no desire to continue with what he termed bourgeois freedoms. So Lenin is the mastermind behind the idea of the revolution. Trotsky is the mastermind of the revolution itself. The story of the revolution really is one of non-resistance, that the Bolsheviks kind of go, let's take power. And they do. And nobody really stands in their way. I hope this has been useful for you. I will continue on in this series of videos, and I will start looking at the Bolshevik communist regime in detail, going all the way through from 17 and eventually getting all the way through to 1964. So going through the Civil War and Lenin in power, and then the power struggle, and then Stalin in power, and then the Stalin taking the Soviet Union through World War II, and then dying in 53, and him being replaced by Khrushchev, and then the period of destalinisation and hardliners and all that kind of stuff. So that's where this playlist is going. I already covered the Provisional Government, the February Revolution, and then going all the way back through Nicholas II, Alexander III, and Alexander II. So it's essentially, it is the story of Russia that I'm working on. I'm a reasonable way through the bit of the story that I'm telling, which is 1855 through to 1964. This playlist is designed for A-level history, in particular for AQA A-level history Unit 1H, and I hope this has been informative and helpful for you all. If it has, then please hit like. If you haven't done so already and you are looking forward to more of these kind of videos, then please subscribe. There are also videos for many other different units, and also in particular there's a huge bunch of stuff on A-level politics as well. So lots and lots of stuff on the channel. Hopefully you will enjoy if you have enjoyed this. Thank you very much for watching.